Hi, welcome to the Political Forum podcast. Today's date is January 17th, 2021, and this is our episode number 2. For those of you watching this for the first time, what we do in this podcast is we invite a special guest who is also a member of the Political Forum, and we discuss politics, commentary on society and culture, and topic du jour. And we do this in an informal setting, but we discuss these topics in depth. And the idea is to have a meaningful conversation on these important issues of the day. And before we get started, I just want to introduce you to our team. Co-hosting with me is the one and only John Kerbow.
Hi there.
What's up, John?
Hey, doing good.
And also joining us is Annat. Hello. And before I introduce you to our guest, just want to explain what it is that we do in this podcast. So we have, our objective is to, for the listeners to listen and watch the podcast and gain some fresh perspective, expand our knowledge, and have fun doing it. So our guest today is Ambre. And now Ambre is someone who I admire tremendously because she has a very independent view and assessment on a lot of the important issues. And I really respect her exercising of the independent judgment on a lot of these issues. She has a background in bachelor's in international political economy. She's also been involved with various aspects of volunteering from local to national levels. And also she has a strong interest in global economy. Hey, Ambre.
Hi, sorry, I was on mute. It's a pleasure being here with everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So guys, happy belated New Year. And have you made any New Year's resolutions?
I would say get out more. Probably just meet new people and try to experience life a little bit more than I have lately.
Yeah, it seems like the quarantine is really making people lethargic and inactive. And I think once we start to get used to our routines, it's really break out of that mold. So I think taking a concerted effort to be active, I think is very helpful both for our mental well-being as well as physical well-being. What about you, John?
Sorry, John, you're on mute.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. No, like I said before, I think during quarantine, it seems like most people have either gained weight or lost weight, gotten in better shape or worse shape, and most people haven't been just static. I've had to find creative ways to stay in shape while at home. I can't do what I usually like to do, which is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for obvious reasons. That's like the worst thing for COVID. But I don't usually do New Year's resolutions because I feel like, setting goals should be like a year-round thing. But this year I felt a real connection to 2020 being over and how everybody's happy about it. So I think my only resolution was to stay focused and finish writing a number of books. One is on psychological warfare and disinformation and how propaganda works, and the other is on police reform and how that can help everybody, and why some of Biden's ideas actually make sense. So yeah, it's try to be better, less distracted. Other than that, nothing really. I was just really happy and enjoying myself.
Yeah, so I think right there you highlighted two of the major stories that pretty much consume the most of the news cycle in 2020, which is the pandemic and the criminal justice reform. So now let me ask you guys, we have maybe 3 days left of the Trump presidency. And if I were to ask Trump supporters, can you tell me what are some of the achievements under the Trump administration? They'll say, well, the First Step Act was certainly a remarkable achievement because it brought together bipartisan support and he was able to sign into law something that was not achievable before him. So what do you think about that?
It's hard. It's hard giving President Trump credit for some of the things that he has done correctly. But overall, I think some things aren't done without prior history or prior education of why these things are necessary in the first place. And so when any policy is implemented, the first thing anyone thinks of is how it's going to instantly make things better without taking into consideration that some of these things are systemic and have been issues for a really long time. And there's a reason why they weren't rushed to be fixed. And so sometimes the policy, which on the surface seems like a good idea, overall has a long-term adverse effect. So I don't know. I feel like, yes, credit should be given. It was a good try with justice reform. But I think more could be done, and if it was like in a more thought out way, it could be better. But it's a good first step. It's a good try.
Yeah, quite literally and also quite metaphorically, first step into the right direction of criminal justice reform. But I guess the alternative would have been just continuing what we've had in the past. And I guess you could give credit where credit is due to policymakers like Senator Rand Paul, who is very conservative. But on this issue, I think a lot of progressives praise him for his stance on it. So, I mean, I think this is one of those instances where you see like a kind of a breakthrough in this partisan gridlock.
Yeah, another Newt Gingrich and Van Jones is another example. They've been working together bipartisan wise on and exposing how our deep divisions should not keep us from seeing the common kind of the shared moral terrain when it comes to criminal justice reform. It should appeal to conservatives fiscally. It's more cost effective. It's more data driven. It's more locally owned and gives more rights to local communities at the city level, at the community and neighborhood level. A lot of alternatives to incarceration involve families and using models that are much more mediated by the community. So criminal justice can be driven in a way that's very bottom up and local instead of micromanaged from the top down. And that's why my entire life, and I grew up, like I said before, in a conservative part of I grew up in Georgia, like I said in the last podcast. So I've been around conservatives and liberals my whole life. I've never understood why so many conservatives used to support very top-down, federally driven policies like the drug war and three strikes law and things like that, and harsh drug penalties and other stuff that seems to go against every one of their core values. And yet, they have a visceral reaction to federal micromanagement, and they tend to promote states' rights in so many other areas. But then there's almost this paradigm flip when it comes to the drug war and criminal justice, where they'll support a large government, often promoting, from the very top, enforcing policies that are disproportionately harsh and cruel as well as cost ineffective and based in emotion. This is the very thing they accuse liberals of doing. So criminal justice reform should appeal to so many conservative values as well. And I think more and more conservatives, I think a majority now by polls, are supportive of it if it's framed in the right way. And I think it's time we sort of tear down this wall of left-right divide when it comes to that issue and show how it's a humanism issue. It's an issue of human dignity, human rights, logic, reason, data-driven solutions, and the fact that there's so many better alternatives at the community level. And then there's decades of research. Like, it makes so much sense to be on the right side of this issue. And I think we got to continue to push that narrative forward.
Yeah, that's
interesting.
That's
always interested me in the. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Amber.
Oh no, one of the things that's always interested me in this topic is that where would there are so many things that are wrong with the judicial system, the way that it's set up now, but I don't know of any like good examples or one pill will solve everything type of solutions that will help with the just the clear imbalance in our justice system. So I'm always a little cautious when explaining justice reform to people, because as soon as you say okay, we really need to take a look at our judicial system, it's disproportionately affecting one group versus the other. I think once we start saying, okay, well, it disproportionately affects Black people, or it disproportionately affects men, I think people start tuning it out, because to them, that sounds like you want preferential treatment. And I don't think either side does a good job of explaining why we need to update our judicial system.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's all about the framing of the issue. So if the issue is framed as there's one group of people who want preferential treatment, a stark departure from what's the regular customary practice, I think people get very offended. But when I talk to a lot of conservatives and those who champion the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, I say, well, look, criminal justice reform is at the heart of the Bill of Rights, because if you look at Fourth Amendment, which is unreasonable search and seizures, which sometimes lead to these arrests, like somebody driving a car gets pulled over, they find, illegal substance in the trunk. Well, that's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Fifth Amendment, the right not to incriminate yourself. And sometimes when these people are taken into custody, they're forced to make certain statements that are now later admissible to convict. So they always rely on these kind of confession or the statements that they wrote under duress. And then we also have the Eighth Amendment, which I think is probably the most crucial one, which is the ban on cruel and unusual punishment. And if you look at a lot of these high rates of incarceration for long periods over things like, marijuana possession, it's kind of unconscionable. So I always bring my conservative friends to the attention of the Bill of Rights. And if you truly want to interpret the Bill of Rights as intended, then you have to be consistent and apply that to the criminal justice reform. And I think they're starting to kind of see that. Seems like when I talk to the progressives, it's more based on, empathy, humanity, humanism, that component to it. I think that could also exist. I think both could exist without, conflicting one another in terms of how to apply those principles. So.
Yeah, I think if we frame the discussion like more broadly, like how does this affect all of us as a country? We are a fifth of the world's population, but we have a quarter of the world's imprisoned people, and it doesn't seem to hit as much when someone says that, and I don't understand why. And I think overall, usually when I hear my progressive friends or my liberal friends bring it up, they're always pretty much laying out, well, this is, disproportionately affecting Black people. Even with policing, it always brings up the fact that it's disproportionately affecting Black people. And I think once you start injecting any type of like race in it, you start to kind of lose people, because overall the system is terrible for everyone. It's as John brought up, it's economically not sound. We're spending tons of money on these prisons and for upkeep. On the local levels, the policing departments are losing a lot of money when it comes to like, not policing departments, but like the states are losing a lot of money when they have all these wrongful death lawsuits. So overall, as a country, all of us are suffering for this. So it's not just a Black and white issue. It's not just a red or a blue issue. It affects everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think finding the right sort of moral language to bridge that divide and to understand the kind of language that will resonate more with conservatives, and especially understanding rural versus urban audiences. And understanding, like my background, I talked about in the last podcast, was, I was in the Army, so my job in part was psychological warfare, what people call PSYOP. And a lot of people think what we do is we, stare at goats and create all these conspiracies, and we're responsible for Antifa actors storming the Capitol and everything's a PSYOP. Most of that stuff is actually not what we do. There was a thing about the Men Who Stare at Goats was actually a book written about some weird experiments they did decades ago. But really, what PSYOP does is, and we don't target American audiences or NATO audiences. PSYOP's job is to affect the battlefield and influence audiences inside the battle space. But at its core, it's about changing behaviors by understanding what kind of messages and narratives will resonate with different target audiences. And there's a lot of research in moral psychology. I often bring up Jonathan Haidt and a lot of the data on the different ways liberals and conservatives tend to process different types of morals and things like that. And they often respond to different ways of framing things. So a lot, like you said, liberals tend to frame things in terms of egalitarianism and fairness. Conservatives often talk about people sharing the load, and they talk about fairness in different ways, or they do, like, both people in general do tend to care about other people, but they're often primed by hearing messages from the other side, and they hear the most extreme, and social media amplifies the most extreme and absurd messages from the other side. So a lot of conservatives are primed to hear the most extreme sides of social justice, so they often reflexively tune out and turn off whenever they hear sensible messages they would otherwise agree with. So the effectiveness of liberal messaging becomes saturated by certain ineffective messaging. And so I think we need a better, like an arms race of effective communication and moral psychology research to say, how do we get through and really engage people on this and identify that shared space of values? And I think one way is to revive the pub culture, and we could do some of this virtually, where people sit down and drink a beer together and they bridge the empathy gap by talking to each other. Because I guarantee you, if the average conservative out there, I'm not talking about extremists, I'm talking about just average people that identify as conservative, would sit down and have just a non-political conversation with a person of color who's really dealt with the unfair side of the justice system, or with anyone who's dealt with it, they would most likely agree that there are certain problems. It's just about how the message is framed. And I would love it if everyone would just agree on it, but sadly, we got to find the best ways to communicate,
So if the issue is due to the extreme or ineffective messaging, wouldn't you agree that the slogan "Defund the Police" is certainly, an ineffective and extreme messaging? What do you think?
Well, God. Well, I'd love to hear, Ambre, I'd love to hear your thoughts here. I'll just say real quick that I constantly run into a lot of resistance by a more extreme wing of the activism community to change their messaging or even reevaluate their messaging or even ask the question, is this phrase effective? They often don't care. They often think the louder and the more extreme, the better. So I think the idea behind Defund the Police is usually that we need to divert more funding to social services and more community building, which will then create conditions where less excessive policing is needed. And that's going to reduce violence and reduce brutality, et cetera, et cetera. That's often what it means. The way it usually comes across due to our polarization is just either abolish or radically defund policing in a way that's going to hurt communities. And if I'm not mistaken, most people, including people of color, based on polls, don't want the latter. They don't want an underfunded police department. They want basic policing that is able to protect them, but they also want policing that will do its job, that is answerable to justice and accountability, and that is not abusive. So I agree with the idea behind defund the police in terms of invest more in communities and social services, create better conditions that will enable a better, more flourishing and less crime and less police brutality and reform the police. I agree with that. But the messaging can often be toxic and have blowback and be counterproductive. Then people double down. Then you have this blue wall, this blue tribalism, where police are more resistive, and it's framed as a false choice. You're either completely for the blue shield and you're pro-police in every way and anti-protester, or you're completely anti-police, defund everything. And this false binary is dangerous, and it literally will get people killed. So yeah, if you're on the left, question your messaging, question your narrative. There's better ways to promote this, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with John on messaging can pretty much ruin whatever goal you were trying to get to. For me, it's a little complicated because part of me believes that these activists are out there, they're protesting, they're trying to garner as much attention to themselves as possible to get some movement on basically a lot of issues that we've not touched on for decades. And in the heat of the moment, when you're on the ground, a lot of things, make sense. A lot of things will, rile people up. But once that happens, there's supposed to be a certain realization that you have to have a list of demands that you really would like acted on. And if you're just out there screaming, at the top of your lungs, you're going to lose a lot of people. But at the same time, I hear, on the other side, things like, lock her up, or I hear things like Democrats are baby killers. And even though these are the fringe and, they don't really, the party as in the whole, as in the Republican Party, does not, subscribe or does not really truly believe this, because it's so loud, a lot of people will associate Democrats as being baby killers, or they will associate like Hillary Clinton as being a criminal. And so on the one side, that type of messaging, that type of like loud, rah, seems to work on one side of the aisle, but on the other side of the aisle, it does not. And it's kind of a little unfair in that sense. Both are wrong. I think both should be corrected, should be asked to, the activists should be asked to explain themselves or give any type of like proof on why they feel the way that they do, or what can be done to fix any of their grievances. But once we get into the whole like negative spiral where we're saying, defund the police or all police are bad, then we kind of lose the message, and it's really unfortunate. But to be fair to the movement, I would say that no one really expects like Democrats to take up the mantle of defund the police. What they expected Democrats to do is to listen to the reforms that they would like to be made, listen to the laws and policies they think are going to actually help with their issues. So it wasn't something that was supposed to be, the face, but it became the face of the movement. But the whole ass became the face of the movement, and I just don't feel right about telling someone who's an activist or someone who's there on the ground trying to make change, you need to be more thoughtful of your messaging, because at the end of the day, when I heard it, I heard reform. Someone else hears it, they hear get rid of the police. And that could be due to experience. That could be due to preconceived notions that, Black people don't like police officers and they want to get rid of them. That could be due to a whole list of other things. So it's not really, for me, it's not really that we have to be careful what we say. We have to really be careful of what comes after we say what we say. And so if somebody wants to be heard or they want actual change, they just have to really work on what comes after the big slogans. But you really can't control how anyone takes anything that's said. Like if you say Black Lives Matter, to me, it's pretty straightforward. Black Lives Matter. I don't ever hear only Black Lives Matter. I don't ever hear that, Black lives are more important than anyone else. But other people take that way. So to me, that could just mean that that person, due to their experiences or preconceived notions, are going to take any messaging that is put out there the way that those experiences will, has taught them to take it in. And you really cannot control what people understand from things that you say. You can just work harder to explain yourself. So I know that was like a really roundabout way, but what I really wanted to just come back to is the pain is real, but it could be packaged better. But at the end of the day, we can't be disingenuous and say, well, just because someone says something this way, that the reason why people don't really subscribe to what they're saying is because of what was said. Sometimes we have to take into consideration that if people want to already have preconceived notions, will use whatever is said as the way to link those two together.
I think that's wonderful. I really, I think I understand everything you're saying. I think the most important thing is that the pain is real, the oppression and the issues are real, and it's to give people a voice above anything else. That is absolutely, I agree, the most important thing is let people have a voice and amplify their voice. And I think that, there's definitely very appropriate, in many cases is perfectly appropriate and understandable and more than justified for people to shout, to be angry, to be riled up. I think that's absolutely understandable. And we can't stop that or suppress it. I think we need to give people a voice. I think we can also, in some context or some ways, work on messaging as a strategy. And I don't think the two are incompatible, but I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, it seems like what you're saying, and I agree, is that there's a time and a place. For example, I've marched with some of these protests, and in some cases, like in Brooklyn, one of the marches was locally led, by mostly by youth and from some of the local leaders, predominantly all people of color. And when you're in those formations, it is important to respect the people that are most affected, that are really the ones at the head of the protest. That is not the time to pull them aside and say, hey guys, let's rethink all the messaging. People, you may not always agree with the way things are framed, but the most important thing is give people a voice. And people are gonna often make noise, and that's inevitable. That's often necessary. And I think that there's a time and a place to try to have conversations about messaging and better tactics and better ways to do things. And I think the number one thing is to respect the voices of people and to appreciate the fact that they're human and they're going to say what they're going to say. And I think we can focus on better messages and narratives, but we have to realize that, like you said, the fact that defund the police may not be the most effective phrase, that is not an excuse not to listen. I think alongside giving people a voice, the most important thing is to listen. And what we need most right now, and the biggest burden here, I don't think, doesn't fall on the activists, it falls on our leaders. They need to listen. They need to listen to people affected by this, listen to the problems, and start to genuinely show that they care, not just by listening, but by committing to change. And it has to be a conversation led by the people most affected. And I learned this firsthand when I was abroad, when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then I applied it and adapted that mindset to working with communities and marginalized groups here in America. Most of what you're doing is you're shutting up and you're listening and you're respecting what people have to say and you're really letting them drive the conversation. And I think that's where a lot of people get lost. A lot of your quote unquote anti-SJWs often, criticize the excesses of the social justice movement. And I think there's certainly a lot of problems there within that movement. But at the same time, they often lose sight of some very valid points that activists try to make. And
Mhm.
and I really, through my books and through writing and through talks and things like that, I try to help bridge that divide by translating this to more people so they understand that, there's a time to listen and amplify voices, and then there's also a time to criticize, but there's the right way to do it and there's the wrong way to do it. And it can be hard, and I think when in doubt, listen. Um, I hope that kind of captures the nuance of what I sounded like you were saying, but
Yeah, I mean, pretty much that's the crux of it. I mean, a lot of these things are said, you know, in the heat of the moment, you know, at grassroots level at its best. And I think it's really for the leaders to be the ones to push the correct the correct narrative, or what, these channel the activist anger, or channel their frustration. I think it's really up to leaders to do that, and to allow people to that are outside the movement, who weren't going to subscribe anyway, to control the narrative. um, is I think, on the people who are for the movement's part. I think they, they let a lot of things slide. I think Democrats had a lot of opportunities to explain what defund the police meant, and how it could work for everyone. But I think they just let the right, control the narrative, and it turned a lot of people off. But overall, what you said is, just because you hear something that you don't like, it doesn't mean that, you should shut down and turn off. You could ask questions like, okay, well, what do you really mean? So that people can have a better understanding. I think all of us have, pretty much gotten sensitive over the past couple of decades, maybe due to the social media, and where we are now have the control to shut on and shut off what we don't like. And I don't think that that's healthy for human discourse, much less, a nation where there are so many diverse people, diverse thoughts, diverse beliefs. We shouldn't just shut down. I think we should just ask more questions and get to the crux of it. Because at the end of the day, we all are human, and we all have human needs. And so we can't just throw out other people's feelings or hurt or frustration just because we don't experience it, we don't understand it. And so that's why I really, at one point, I do implore the activists to be a little bit more, a little bit more controlling with their message and what is said. But on the other hand, I don't want to negate that the possibility that people are just, if they don't want to listen, if it doesn't fit their narrative, they're not going to. And no amount of semantics is going to fix that.
right.
So we have to get better at people just listening and asking
Absolutely.
questions.
And I think getting more people, lifting up more voices and amplifying more voices, and also getting more people, more average people to listen
Mhm.
is absolutely crucial. And I think there are ways to socially incubate that through video chats, YouTube videos, people sitting down, having conversations and filming it. I think most average people are potentially receptive to getting involved in activism without having to be activists, quote unquote. I think everybody should be in some level an activist. And I think getting more people involved in, uplifting these issues is absolutely crucial. I don't think we can leave it to the hardcore people on the ground to do everything. I think, if we're going to complain about some of the excesses of the left or whatever, I think it's on everyday citizens to start identifying with, combating the problems and saying we're going to have solidarity and we're going to actually force, change in one way or another. So yeah, trying to bridge that empathy gap, I think, is really big, because so many people don't, like, I can't directly relate to a lot of issues that, you know, people of color or people that are gay or lesbian or a variety of people, I'm never going to be able to directly relate to them, but I can still invoke moral imagination where you imagine what it's like to be the other person. And you can at least have those empathy neurons fire off in your brain through, you know, at least imagining what it's like. And if you can't directly relate, you can still have empathy, and that could be channeled intelligently through the right kind of, activism or just pushing for change. And so I think bridging the empathy gap and getting more average people involved is absolutely key. And I think shutting off a lot of the loud toxic noise, especially the kind amplified by the right through all the meme warfare and all the shouting and all the caricatures of activists. I mean, there are some excesses, like I said, within the left, but the right often creates very inaccurate caricatures and makes it look like that's the mainstream. And then the Russian disinformation campaigns do this as well. They amplify some of the most extreme caricatures of feminism or Black activism or Black Lives Matter, and they amplify this. They purposely, surgically target certain audiences, especially conservatives, to stoke their fears and their resentments and make them think that the average BLM activist is an extremist or that they hate white people. And of course, none of that's true. It isn't. But millions of people believe that. And if we can find a way to reduce some of the toxic fringe noise and get people out of those echo chambers and get them into a space of real conversation and empathy, that might help get more people involved. And I might be wrong, but I hope I'm not, that this is possible. It has to be, because if not, I think the status quo is patently unsustainable when it comes to police and mass incarceration and drug wars and things like that. We cannot sustain a system that fundamentally pits our police and our government against the population. And I've been to war zones where we see this firsthand. If you cannot have an ongoing system where the population is constantly at war. We have to find ways that address these problems and address the root causes. Otherwise, we're going to have more riots, more instability. And that's where I think conservatives need to get on board. The sooner we fix these problems, the less likely your city is going to be on fire. And
unfortunately,
it's just,
we really don't want cities on fire. That we do not.
Most people don't. I know it's most people, but a lot of people believe that's what most activists want to do, is burn down cities. It's absolutely not true, but it's how
especially cities they live in.
Right.
They'd like to go home and be able to go to the store like everybody else, and it just gets the anger and the frustration, not having a voice and not having an outlet. It just takes over people. And if we can understand crimes of passion, I think to be fair, there's sometimes where literally we won't see this coming unless we fix the issues of our country. If we don't want these riots to keep happening, whether it's on the left or the right, we need to start listening more.
Yeah, so speaking of fixing the issues of the country, we are going to go to the video shortly, but I just want to address the point that John raised in response to what Ambre just said. I think John is alluding to this phenomenon known as weaponization of social media. So John was proposing, well, we need to bridge that empathy gap. However, because social media has been weaponized for whatever ideologies to then use it for their very nefarious purpose, it's dividing us even further. And I think once the history books are written in terms of social media, I think the slogan, defund the police, will certainly go down as another phenomena where at the heat of the moment, people will just blurt something at a protest. It goes viral, it gets a hashtag, and then next thing you know, this is everywhere trending on social media. I've read a lot of articles about what happened in Camden, New Jersey, and also I've talked to a lot of activists and those who are kind of behind this movement. I think what they really meant to say was not defund the police in the most literal sense, but I think they wanted to hold police accountable. I think that's really the overall objective. And then if you were to elaborate that further, well, what do you mean by hold police accountable? They'll say hold police accountable through the purse strings, through the power of the purse strings that the government has. So once you control the purse strings, well, guess what? Then you get to kind of allow police departments locally to then reform. And I think if you look at what happened in Camden, New Jersey, it was exactly that. They basically, started from blank slate. They said the existing system that we have right now is unattainable. You have such high incarceration rates, high levels of crime, and these officers are just not acting in the best interest of the community. Now, in the case of Camden, what's interesting is it was actually the police union that kind of blocked a lot of these reform measures. And the irony there is it's the union, the labor union that the liberals always champion. Well, guess what? They're the forces that block any meaningful change. So if you look at what took place in Camden, which is used as a success story that could be adopted in different places throughout the country, I think if they were to start from scratch through the power of the purse strings, and then make sure that the union no longer has a stranglehold on any meaningful reforms, then you can get a representation of the law enforcement that's representative of the community. And you do that by rehiring them as if they're coming in for the first time through the interview process, screening process, and most importantly, training. So I think, to me, that's what a long-winded explanation of defund the police means. But obviously, we're in a very attention span driven society that no one really wants to elaborate on that. And we just always cling to certain slogans, or we have these kind of adverse, visceral reactions to slogans. And I think that's what defund the police is. But Ambre had mentioned about how we need to look at leaders, especially the national leaders, to make sure that, okay, well, now you're entrusted with certain powers on a national stage, and what can you do? And we're going to take a look at this video that we have queued up, and that's going to contrast some of the measures that President Trump took during his administration, and then let's try to juxtapose that with Biden's record. So Annat, if that video is ready, let's take a look.
Criminal justice reform, and specifically reducing the U.S. prison population, is one of the few issues where both parties have moved closer together rather than farther apart. But for President Trump and his Democratic challenger, former Vice President Joe Biden, there are some significant differences in their records and beliefs.
I want to thank President Donald John Trump. Woo!
One of the first 2020 campaign ads from President Trump focused on his criminal justice reform efforts and his commutation and subsequent pardon of Alice Marie Johnson. Johnson was given a life sentence for nonviolent drug trafficking charges with no prior offenses on her record. The Trump administration also passed the First Step Act, which has reduced the federal prison population by at least 5,000 people since 2018. But some of his tough-on-crime views run counter to the goal of ending mass incarceration. President Trump supports cash bail, the death penalty, and privately run prisons. And while Joe Biden supports none of those things, he played a large part in solidifying the mass incarceration problem in the first place. As a senator, Biden helped write the 1994 crime bill, which enacted stricter sentencing for federal prisoners and offered federal funding for states to do the same. Now he has countered that legislation with a $20 billion grant program proposal that would reward states for lowering their incarceration population. But the big difference between these candidates isn't after you've been arrested, it's before.
No justice!
While Joe Biden has embraced the need for police reform and supported large-scale protests across the country, President Trump has aligned himself closely with police, referred to Black Lives Matter as a symbol of hate, and joked about police brutality.
Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, I said you can take the hand away.
How does that play out on a policy level? Well, for one, the Trump administration discouraged federal investigations of police departments and court-enforced reform measures, aka consent decrees. These consent decrees were a major part of the Obama administration's police reform efforts, and Joe Biden wants to continue using this tool if elected. The consent decrees have had mixed results across the country, but in Cleveland, for example, the local police saw a 20% drop in use of force cases since 2017. A common misconception is Joe Biden's stance on efforts to defund the police.
Now it's gotten totally out of control, and it's really because they want to defund the police, and Biden wants to defund the police.
Sir, he does not.
Despite the president's comments and campaign ads, Joe Biden does not want to defund the police.
President Trump says that you want to defund the police.
Do you?
No, I don't. I don't want to defund police departments. I think they need more help. They need more assistance.
His platform actually calls for an increase in police spending, specifically an additional $300 million to, quote, reinvigorate community policing. Jamal Andrus, Newsy.
So what do you think? Especially the scorecard at the end, they're keeping tabs of, well, what's their track record on eliminating cash bail, death penalty, defund the police. It seems like they're trying to compare and contrast, which of the two are more, I guess, rigid in their law enforcement positions.
I don't know. I feel like it's a race to the bottom with this. On the one hand, you have Trump, who has pardoned a lot of people due to some of the demonization of people who have possession of drugs or have used drugs. That was pretty much approved and but approved by Joe Biden back in the 90s. And then now all of a sudden, maybe because he has had a come to Jesus moment, or because of political expedience, he does not endorse anymore. But on the other hand, Trump has always had a history of having issues with not being fair to people of color. Also, he's very outspoken about how he believes in police departments, and he believes in over policing. He thinks that that what the police are doing are just fine, and what happened with all the riots that happened last year, all the protests that happened last year, and just the complete overaggression in policing those protests, and him backing it the whole time. So it's kind of hard to, because usually I always say, don't listen to what someone says, watch what they do. And both Biden and Trump have done things that contradict each other, contradict what they are saying and what they're doing. So I don't know if it's like it's for political expedience to get more people to vote for you. At the end of the day, we suffer for it when no one takes these type of issues serious enough to try to figure out what the root problem is, and go through the growing pains of having uncomfortable conversations and making difficult decisions. Personally, I think it's extremely hard for police officers to do the jobs that they do. I think they don't get enough recognition for, going out there and putting their lives on the line every day. I don't think they're paid enough. I know in certain counties, even here in New York, where police officers make less than I did as an entry-level administrative assistant back 10 years ago. And so, and yet these people are out here, keeping us safe. So I don't think they're paid enough, and I don't think they are thanked enough. But at the same time, that does not negate that there are a lot of bad apples in the police department, and there are not enough recourses to weed them out. And instead of looking internally and trying to fix those issues, it's more of we're the authority, and we do not appreciate any type of dissent, which every institution of power should always have some way, some fail-safe to protect the populace from pretty much authoritarianism. I just don't believe that just because you have power that I can assume that you will always use it correctly. And think it goes deeper than racism. I think when it comes to the police department, it's more of a power struggle. I think it's more of a, I have the ability and the authority to do anything I want to you, and there's no repercussions. So I think we really need to take a look at that. I don't think that is sustainable anywhere, much less here in America.
Yeah, what's been shocking, absolutely. What's been shocking to me is the fact that we've been at war for 2 decades in a post 9/11 counterinsurgency environment in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have literally our veterans, especially those in like special warfare, civil affairs, things like that, have enormous experience and lessons learned from counterinsurgency. And what that means is understanding how the enemy, how extremists and terrorists can hide within the population. And if there are unstable conditions for the population, then violence will continue to flourish. And you have to address root causes, and you have to listen to grievances. And if those things are not addressed, you're going to continue to have this vacuum of instability that's going to be filled by your extremists and by your toxic narratives and propaganda. Radicalization will continue. So, I mean, I saw this with the Mahdi army and the radicalization of young Shia in Baghdad and Basra and places like that, just as one example. And the kind of reciprocal extremism between Sunni and Shia militants and death squads. And of course, most Sunni and Shia are not, extremists. They're people trying to live their lives and survive. But when you don't address root causes, violence will flourish. And everyone who is serious about the modern battlefield abroad understands this. And we have all these veterans, and people often pay homage to veterans, but we are not listened to by our policymakers when we try to tell them you have to address root causes. And it's bad enough that they don't listen. Our leaders tend to ignore, marginalized people. That itself is terrible. But you also have veterans saying we have 2 decades of war fighting. We're trying to take these lessons from the war zone and apply it here to build peace at home, so we don't make the same mistakes. And the first thing they need to do is like you said, start listening, listen to the grievances and address the root causes. And with police reform, I think there's going to need to be reform at the top when it comes to accountability and breaking down some of this blue wall to the point where, bad apples are weeded out. There's a better recruitment process, better selection, better vetting, and also better training. And that's where you have your tactical solution, where, for example, I'm a huge advocate of police departments everywhere having access to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I train with some of the Gracies and talk to people in the BJJ community. They're constantly trying to advocate and work with police to make policing safer. So when you're better able to control a suspect, you're less likely to react out of fear and less likely to hurt them. And you're in control of the situation. And a lot of these people are a lot of these police departments, especially in rural areas and smaller towns, are underfunded, undertrained, at no fault of the officers. And training is not taken seriously. And even worse, training for police is often not continuous. They go through police academy, and then they're constantly out there walking the beat and arresting people, sometimes based on unwritten quotas, or arresting them for sleeping out on a park bench or peeing themselves in public because someone's schizophrenic. And instead of having social services deal that, police are overstretched and they're not able to continuously train. And in the military, we have to continually train and maintain proficiency. So, if you don't continually train on something, you lose proficiency. You have to maintain that. And so police need to constantly train on responding to various situations, dealing with different types of people, how to safely control suspects, how to engage protesters, how to avoid escalating a protest. And some situations are unwinnable. I admit that. There's sometimes when police have to react a certain way. They're in a very difficult situation. And I completely, a lot of my friends are cops. A lot of people I serve with in the reserves currently are police officers too. And I'm very sympathetic to that. But at the same time, there are many times when they make mistakes I see on YouTube videos by the hundreds. I'm like, how the hell do you make that mistake? Where's the training? This would not be allowed in the military. In the military, you're always learning from your mistakes. You're always adapting. We have entire laboratories of war fighting, like out in the desert where we play war on a large scale over, many miles, and we use like mock-up tanks and helicopters and hundreds of role players speaking Arabic, and we have soldiers, entire brigades playing war, basically Army's version of LARPing laser tag. And but what we're doing is we're learning from failure. We're constantly learning where we go wrong. Police need a system where they continually train. And this requires, like Joe Biden said, more funding for the right things. And then we need to strip away some of the toxic areas, some of the bad things. Less drug war, more training. That's what my book's about, and that's what I'm hoping can resonate with more of our leaders and with police leadership as well. So police will stop seeing this as a zero-sum game, and they can say, all right, maybe reform can be in the best interest of everybody. That's what I'm hoping for.
So the key to criminal justice reform is more jujitsu training. So I look forward to the day.
I was talking about police reform. Criminal justice reform is different. That would be that would be based on really like listening to the problems and looking at data-driven solutions that show there are much more cost-effective and humane ways to protect the dignity and rights of people and also reduce crime and cut cost. We have like the Center for Court Innovation is respected globally, or there's people from Europe that travel to Brooklyn and Red Hook, and they learn from the Red Hook Justice Center. They learn from the Center for Court Innovation on effective models of justice reform. This stuff's been going on for a long time. Our leaders just need to listen and stop appointing people like freaking, Jeff Sessions and people that came out of the Stone Age. We need people that can actually look at data and realize that, reform is best for everybody. And it's also the humane and moral thing to do.
And I think real quick that one of the things that we also need to do is figure out what exactly are we trying to achieve. We have so many laws that are basically just there as a deterrent for illegal activity, but yet we still have a lot of illegal activity. So I don't understand what the prison system is for. Is it supposed to be for punishment or for reforming people who cannot be in society due to them not respecting laws and respecting the society, their communities, and the society as a whole. So once we take another look at why we're doing this, then we can work from there on what works best. I hate bringing up Sweden because, Sweden is a much smaller country. It's a lot more homogenous, but they took a more, a more humanistic approach, and it's been working for them. They try to not exactly blame, try to punish people for committing crimes, but they're trying to find out what the root cause is. Like if you get arrested for assault, that doesn't mean you go to jail. It means that maybe you go to anger management classes and you're monitored. If you are caught with like a little bit of drugs and stuff like that, that doesn't automatically mean you go to jail. That means you go to like drug rehab and try to fix your addiction problems that you might be having. So there are that just there's not a zero-sum approach where you're a bad person, we're going to just lock you up with other bad people and throw away the key and hope to God you never come out of prison, because this is what it feels like. We have a revolving door of people in and out of prison who in the beginning start off with something small, and then they're crowded in with a bunch of more hardened criminals, and they're going to have to do things to try to survive while they're there. And then because they have a lower, they were in there for something small to begin with, they have a lower sentence, and then they leave. And then they do even worse crimes, and then they come back into the system.
Yeah.
It's a revolving door. We're not solving our problem. It's not working. And we really need to overall rethink what it is we want to get out of this.
I don't understand how we take a scientific approach to everything from nanotechnology to go into Mars, and yet we can't even apply the most basic scientific thinking to something obvious like recidivism. And to me, this should be more of a scientific problem than a problem of moral outrage. And I think if it's looked at as a problem of public health and looking at data and looking at what works and looking at it logically and scientifically, that'll reduce human harm immensely. And a lot of times we need to distinguish between like your extremely hard criminals or your, serious violent crimes from your nonviolent crimes. So a lot of people will instinctively say, well, some people are bad and need to be locked up, and rapists and murderers and drug cartel and things like that. And that's what they're thinking about. Whereas we're usually talking about nonviolent offenders. And so I try to talk to conservatives that are big on saying, well, incarceration lowers crime sometimes when it comes to the, more violent crimes, but they need to uncouple that from talking about nonviolent crimes and recidivism and low-level offenses and get people to see it, like you said, in not a zero-sum way, but a more nuanced way. But it sounds like you brought up a really good point. I think we need to reevaluate the moral roots of what our prison system is about. Like, I think it was founded on a lot of puritanical and religious ideas of punishment. Is it about retributive justice, which is based on punishing, or is it focused on restorative justice, which is about reducing harm? And I think it should be based on the latter. And even if you insist on punishing the rapist and the murderers and some of the worst people, you should still admit that for the vast majority of incarceration, it should be about harm reduction. It should be restorative. And that should be driven by data and by science. Otherwise, you might as well sacrifice a chicken or, use astrology or something to determine the best way to punish people, because a lot of our laws are about as archaic as things that existed in the 1600s. It makes no sense. They're not grounded in moral logic. They're grounded in sort of visceral emotions and this puritanical desire to feel better than other people. Explain why someone who used LSD is serving a life sentence. I mean, that, as far as I know, things like that happen. If people knew some of the sentences that nonviolent drug offenders are currently serving, it would blow their mind. It is moral insanity, but because we dehumanize criminals, we say, well, they don't matter. Well, they do. The system should be based on moral logic. If not, then why do we call ourselves a moral, just society? And why should we pride ourselves in, going to the moon and beating the Russians, to the moon? But we accept a justice system that is about as superstitious as things coming out of the Dark Ages when it comes to a lot of our laws. It makes no sense,
And then a lot of the issues that are happening in prison are because there are societal issues that we are not really coming to grips with either. A lot of criminals are mentally ill. A lot of criminals are also homeless. So a lot of nuanced reasoning would say, okay, well, this person who is who's been to jail for like 10 years for stealing, breaking and entering and stealing something, has been in jail for 10 years. They're illiterate, they can't read or write. They've been in jail through most of their 20s. And now now that they're out of jail, we're spitting them back into the population where they don't have any prospects because, one, they've been to jail, so you already have that stigma. So no one's going to hire them. Two, they still have a little process because, again, they were illiterate when they went in and they're illiterate when they came out. So very few prospects. And, they've been out of the system they've been out of society for a while. And so a lot of things have changed. A lot of innovations have happened, like social media and other things that they missed out on, that they're now trying to relearn and try to reintegrate themselves in a society that does not want them because they've been to prison. And so what alternative do they have but to go back to what they've known, which is prison?
Right.
So it's just a revolving door. If we don't fix our mental health institutions, if we don't fix our educational institutions, we're just holding a bunch of people in these cell blocks indefinitely, because that's all they're ever going to amount to, because the society is not out there to help them or fix it.
Right. It's almost like if there's a cliff and we want people on the good side of the cliff, and then some people go to the bad side, and we could build a bridge to get them back on the good side of the cliff, but we withhold that bridge. We refuse to build a bridge. It's like we want people to continue to be on the wrong side of the law and to continue to go through the revolving door. Why would you withhold the basic tools to let them, reintegrate back into society? It makes absolutely no sense. I mean, it is so many of our laws or our system is so counterintuitive. A lot of people think that some of it is by design, and I try to be as skeptical and open-minded about that as possible. I think most of it is a combination of incompetence and archaic types of thinking and other things. But there's some valid concerns that some of this might be by design, and I feel like there's a massive distrust, a break of social contract between a lot of our population and our justice system, and that is the opposite of what a justice system should be. Whether you're going off Dr. King or you're going off Aristotle or hundreds of years of philosophy, systems of justice should be restorative. They should be about a social contract between, the citizens and the people and their rights and the idea of public good and the people, the leaders who uphold it. And our system seems to be the opposite. But I think we're moving in the right direction. I think if you look at opinion polls, more and more people, including conservatives, do support drug reform and I think to some degree justice reform. And I'm encouraged by the Biden and Harris administration, moving forward on this. I'm not too optimistic, but I think there's some hope. Then again, I've never been directly impacted by this the way a lot of people have. So I understand if a lot of people are very pessimistic too.
Yeah, if I could just address John's observations about how we make certain major public policy decisions based on visceral reactions. And I think John's examples about battlefields, that's very relevant, because if you look at the war on terror that we engaged in for the past 20 years, that was based on a visceral reaction. Of course, what happened in the wake of 9/11 was tragedy, but then we decided to take that and use that to viscerally, use and deploy military forces to a tune of $8 trillion. And then now people are, kind of looking back and like, wow, what do we do? And we're still entangled in these misadventures, and maybe it wasn't worth it. And I believe that our response to the criminal justice system, or the criminal justice that we have now, is also based on some of the visceral reactions. Whenever you see like a front cover, splash about some kind of horrific violent crime, we automatically resort to, okay, well, we just need more cops on the streets, and we got to lock these people up, and not thinking about some of the long-term ramifications of just, suspending independent judgment and evidence and just using force as the last resort to, hold people in captivity. So I think that's a really tragedy. And then I know John mentioned before about Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations. So here's one way to kind of understand why you have some people, especially those who are conservative, who give deference to law enforcement and to the military, because one of the pillars of moral foundation is authority and respect. And I think some conservatives think, well, look, if I, give as much deference to the people of power with authority and give them the respect, then that's a good thing. It's a moral thing to do. But sometimes I think we need to not suspend our independent thinking and just simply, give them blind faith support. I think we need to be more critical of the powers that we entrust to them. And if I could address Ambre's kind of rhetorical, open-ended question about, well, what is the criminal justice system intended to achieve? I think John kind of hit it on the head in the sense that there are two different types of philosophies when it comes to criminal justice. Is it based on retribution, or is it based on restoration? I think a lot more people are inclined to go with the latter, the restoration. But if it's the restoration, that we have to ask ourselves, as taxpayers, because again, we are paying into the system, don't we want to have these people who are currently incarcerated to be trained and to have all the skills necessary so we could reduce the recidivism rate to as zero as possible? I think that should really be the goal. So whatever sentence these people who are incarcerated have, whether it's number of years or even decades, make sure that the number one goal is they are ready to kind of hit the ground running, to use that expression. So when they re-enter the society, yes, it's going to be a lot different, because technology is going to be different. The way how our society functions is going to be different. We give them the tools so that maybe they could get some kind of diploma, training, and they could find themselves back positioned into society and avoid the recidivism. I think that should be the objective. And I think we should measure the metrics of the success of our system based on recidivism and the successful reentry into the system. So with that being said, somebody mentioned about Biden-Harris administration. So I think their record is a bit kind of murky too, because again, Biden's been a senator for decades, and the vice president, Kamala Harris, is a former attorney general for the state of California. So that's kind of controversial too, because on one hand, you want somebody, I guess, from Democrat standpoint, they want somebody progressive. But state prosecutors inherently are not progressive. They want to bring some sense of criminal justice on behalf of the state. So how do you reconcile those two things? What do you think?
Real quick, I feel like even though the role of a prosecutor is somewhat inevitable, I believe, as part of our system, I think the main criticism of Kamala Harris was that as a prosecutor, even though prosecutors, are doing their necessary role, the argument is that she was overzealous with nonviolent drug offenders, and that her track record there is very problematic. And Biden, of course, has baggage as well. And I don't deny either of those things. I think there's considerable baggage there in the past. I think moving forward, people can always change. And I think moving forward, this might be the right critical juncture in history where there's enough demand generated by all the protest and all the instability, where people are finally going to say, we have no choice but to move forward. And for me, I guess maybe my bar is pretty low because of the last 4 years, they're both functioning adults. So just that alone causes me to breathe a huge sigh of relief. But that was kind of where I was coming from there. I've heard Biden, I think, propose, he often does talk sensibly about ways to move forward when it comes to that. So I'm hoping moving forward, it'll be better than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, but given Biden's long history and track record of things that are very harmful to the communities of colors, how can he then reconcile and say, I'm going to be the champion of those communities? It just seems like it's such 180 that we haven't really seen a very well-reasoned explanation.
He's going to have to be held accountable. I think people are going to have to demand, really, really keep him in check. Any leader, but certainly someone with that history. So yeah, I'm definitely not pushing a narrative of Saint Biden by any means. But and you make a very good point. I understand why a lot of people are really distrustful. I don't blame them. I wouldn't tell them to put blind trust in this by any means. It's going to take a lot of accountability and pressure, I think.
And what about his vice president, Kamala Harris? Again, she will be a historic person in the sense that, first female vice president, person of color. What does that mean for the country? Have we, kind of come to grips with our, past history, if I could use that expression?
I always think it's a little too, we suffer from pretty much saying mission accomplished before the last soldiers left. So I don't necessarily think that because we've had a biracial president, which was Obama, or having a biracial vice president, that just shuts the door on racism and fixes everything in terms of at least how we view ourselves in the world. I think we still have a long way to go, and I think it's a little too premature to say that one person is going to fix decades, if even centuries worth of issues just by their very presence. So to be fair to her, I think yes, she's had a track record as being a very aggressive prosecutor. I'm a wait and see type of person. Like words are one thing, actions are another. But I do take into consideration that with her actual experience with the justice system, by being a part of it, she knows where the problems are. She is able to look back and say, well, I can see why other prosecutors will be that way. I could see how the laws, how prosecutors use those laws in the ways that they do, because she's, been a part of that system. Same thing with Biden. He has experience being a legislator. So I think he will have that that experience to be able to say, well, now looking back on what happened with the criminal with the bill that he passed before, where he highly criminalized drug use, that he understands now that the impact it can have, although unknowingly, is real, and the pain is real. And so these things need to be taken into consideration whenever passing any type of legislation that affects the populace in the way that it did. So for me, it's a wait and see, but I am hopeful because they are both experienced in the places where these changes need to happen, and they're saying the right things right now. But overall, it Rome wasn't built in a day, and all these issues did not just happen yesterday. It will take a really long time, maybe generations, to get us on the right track and really just meet the standard of treating each other equally.
Yeah, so on that note, the incoming Biden administration, his close advisors, the members of the cabinet, they're boasting that as the most diverse team of people surrounding the president. And I guess that's one thing to celebrate, but on the other hand, it just seems like their recruiting committee was just so fixated on making sure that the appearance of diversity was like the most important criteria, kind of overlooking maybe, are they competent, or do they have the qualifications? And I mean, on one hand, you could certainly, praise that as, being like breaking the glass ceiling. But on the other hand, it seems like it could also cause some backlash and resentment, don't you think?
Well, I feel like all the cabinet members that I've seen so far are extremely experienced and well qualified for their positions. And yes, I don't disagree that on face value, when you see anyone say, well, I'm going to go out there and make sure I have the most diverse cabinet, in history and stuff like that, the initial reaction is, okay, well, is it more important that this person's a woman? Is it more important that this person is a part of, some type of marginalized group? Or is it more important that they can do the job that they're set up to supposed to be doing? And I think, at least from what I've seen so far, everyone that he's chosen has been extremely qualified. It's just also, as a society, we have to actually think about why automatically we assume, and I'm not saying you in general, but I just think I find what happens when someone says something like that, like, I'm going to ensure that I have a diverse team with me, or a diverse cabinet, the automatic assumption is that people will not be worthy. Because for me, it almost sounds like, well, automatically we assume that, there aren't, any intelligent women or competent Black people, that there aren't enough competent people in all these different marginalized groups. I mean, that's what I hear when I hear that criticism. And it's extremely not true. There are many people who just need an opportunity, who just need someone to just only take in consideration what they can bring to the table versus their skin color. And I think by saying that you're pledging to do this is a step in the right direction. I don't necessarily think that anyone makes any type of decision about someone solely because of their race or their gender or their sexuality. So I think, that's basically how I felt about it.
Well, I would say, no, I agree. I think, I think you can definitely find qualified people amongst, all these different groups. There's plenty of people in the population that can fill these roles and create this diverse group or cabinet. There's no shortage of skill and talent and expertise. I think I think it's good as long as it's done in a way that really does bring the right people in based on their merits, while also creating this diversity of perspectives. I think it's important, especially now, to really get the diversity of perspectives and see things people aren't going to see and cover those blind spots. I think having diversity for the right reasons can really bring those perspectives in, but it also needs to be done right. And there are problems, I think, like Thomas said, when sometimes people do just try to fill quotas or just try to create an appearance or a facade. And virtue signaling is a real thing, even though it's often the term's overused. Sometimes people are just trying to maintain an appearance, but I think it's absolutely doable to bring in the right team and really make it diverse for the right reasons in a sincere way and have it filled by qualified people. I haven't looked at this in depth of who he's hired because I've been so busy with a bunch of things I'm doing, but I'll definitely take a look. If what you say is true and it's qualified people, then I think that's excellent. I think we always need to ask the right question: are these people being brought on in a sincere way, in good faith? Or are you bringing on qualified people? And if that's the case, I think awesome.
And I think
Yes.
even with virtue signaling too, that a lot of people misunderstand that everyone doesn't think alike. I think we need to get out of this this habit of putting everyone in this box. I am a Black woman. I live next to other Black women. I have Black women in my family. None of us think alike. We don't. So there's not a clear definition on, and there shouldn't be a clear definition on what all Black people think or what all Black people are going to do. And I mean, we had a lot of women in Trump's cabinet, a lot of women that Trump hired. And that still didn't mean that, women's issues progressed. It didn't mean that that all women, agreed with the women that were actually empowered. And that's fine. I think we really need to let go of this idea that everyone thinks alike. And once you get this person in this position that will solve or wipe away all our issues with marginalized groups, and just not true. Because if we had more representation, I think people would see that we, like everyone else, we are have differing opinions, differing values, and we are just individuals like everyone else. But I think because everyone's so used to holding everyone into like some type of label or category, we get stuck with things that are seem like there is a push to not incorporate people of different groups. And then we have, points where we see people just doing it to fill a quota, and they're not, doing it on a real basis. And so I think having more representation will help with that, so we can eventually stop with this, oh, this is the first Black woman, or this is the first anything. This is the 21st century. We shouldn't have these monikers anymore. We are all people, and we all, don't think the same way.
Well,
Yeah. I think go ahead, John.
I was just going to say that I noticed the further you go on either side of the political map, the further left or right you go, the more I encounter people thinking that groups think alike. Like, I can't tell you how many white people on the far left, right, I've encountered that just rigidly apply these categories and believe that, or at least talk like they believe, that people of different skin colors all think a certain way. And they often try to speak to them while telling me not to speak to them, or they'll tone police while lecturing me on tone policing. It just almost becomes like robotic. It's like you're arguing with the worst version of a bot. And I'm like, what gets people in this headspace? It really is nauseating, and I'm sure it's, extremely unproductive. But absolutely, there's so much diversity of perspectives and life experiences. Um, I totally agree. But yeah, Thomas, what were you going to say?
Yeah, just going back to Ambre's point, I think a step in the right direction is something we could certainly celebrate as society. And I think we could all appreciate the fact that you have something, whether if it's administration or faculty or board of directors, what have you, that represents our society, because our society is very complex and diverse. I think that's a great thing. But I think there comes a point where that step in the right direction, the celebration of it, then crosses over into kind of like, rub it in your face against those who are now disenfranchised. And I think the next video that we're going to share, it's by Coleman Hughes, who I respect. He's a bit of a contrarian when it comes to these issues. And he explains this kind of a reverse racism phenomenon that could certainly unfold in the near future. So if that video is ready, let's take a look and we'll comment on it.
This is increasingly a problem, especially for our politics as a country. The way I think of it, I mean, do you remember the Sarah Jeong controversy, where the New York Times hired Sarah Jeong as a writer who had a several year-long history of tweeting really vile things about white people, celebrating the fact that white people might stop breeding, for example, things that would be recognized as straightforwardly racist if they were said about black people. In fact, Candace Owens retweeted, she copy pasted Sarah Jeong's tweets, but replaced the word white with black, and got banned from Twitter almost instantly.
Wow.
And then reinstated, which I think is telling it.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I'm not saying Sarah Jeong, I think in her social context, those kind of tweets are not to be read as statements of eugenic intent, or there's a kind of coded language that they far left social justice warriors kind of use as more of a signal of their wokeness rather than a commitment to exterminating white people. But the problem is that if you're sort of a typical middle America white person who watches Fox News and you voted for Trump, maybe you don't like everything about him, but and you're watching Fox News and you see New York Times hires writer who has said that she wants white people to stop breeding, and New York Times did not apologize for this. Nope. You just have to imagine how that reads to the typical white person who perhaps has concerns about immigration, about a changing country, and the way in which they feel that there's nothing left for them on the left, right? Like at this point, you have the biggest left-wing newspaper, the most respected, hiring a person who is just shamelessly hiring a person without apology, who just said the most vile things about people that look like you. And this is a huge problem for our politics. I mean, you have to wonder why so many people are Trump supporters who know that Trump lies a lot. They know that he's a scummy person, but they don't care because look at the alternative. I mean, the alternative is just a half of the political spectrum that celebrates their non-existence. That's a problem politically that is only getting worse and worse. And I think it's just we have to be willing to call out anti-white racism, and we can't settle for redefining the word racism.
I was going to ask, because I've heard people say there's no such thing as reverse racism.
Yes, that is the most. Imagine, like, you could do this with any word. You could let's just redefine the word murder to only mean when you kill a black person. We could do that. We could just decide to come up with a different word, but you can't change the underlying ethical status of an action by redefining it, right? Like racism, you just call it something else. It's still just as bad as it was yesterday when you change the terminology. So yeah, this is an incredibly silly thing that's been done with that word.
Yeah.
And it's having terrible consequences for our politics.
Okay, your reactions, thoughts?
So I want to preface the next things that I say, because I know semantics can be a very dangerous thing. When I say anything about like white people, or use any type of general terminology about a group, I personally know that I am not trying to blanket the definition of whatever I'm saying to all white people, or all whichever group I'm using at the time. I think it's very important to explain what people mean when they say things, and obviously to educate themselves and do their research before they make mass statements like that. However, to further a conversation, sometimes it is just more expedient to use a generalization of a subject, and I don't necessarily think that is wrong. I just think, as if you do not tag on an explanation of what you mean direct, like right away, then it can be misconstrued as you believe all of this group is like whatever you're describing. So I just wanted to start with that. For me personally, I do not understand, I do not support the idea of reverse racism. I grew up with the Webster's Dictionary as my like daily homework. And when I see racism in the dictionary, in the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it specifically states that it's definitely a benefit that race is, that someone thinks, or not someone, is this idea that one race is better than the other, and also uses, because of that that belief, uses the system to enact political, economic, social blockades. That is not, I'm paraphrasing right now, so that's not the full definition, but it does specifically state that there is an action upon that belief. It doesn't say that just because you believe that your race is better than the other, that is all you need for racism. That's all you need for belief systems like to discriminate. That's all you need for stereotyping. But for when it comes to racism, there's a whole system that is involved when it comes to racism. So it's not that I don't believe that minorities can't be discriminatory or biased or stereotypical. I just don't think they are ever in the seat of power enough to be able to be racist towards white people. I think a lot of this is due to this understanding that, like anytime a person of color tries to like say negative things about white people, or have a criticism about white people, the reaction comes from this idea that, well, everybody is saying that Blacks wants to be, or people of color want to be treated fairly like whites. And so if a white person can't do it, then a person of color can't do it. And I think that is a little immature in what we're asking for when it comes to being treated equally, because there are a lot of things that go with this this equality. It's not just equality, it's equity as well. We have a history of atrocious things being done to us by white people, and it didn't just go away. It didn't just stop. It renamed itself, it reshaped itself, but it's pretty much still there. And so to now use the reaction of those atrocities, the reaction that Black people have towards white people, as a way to say, well, no, if you want to be fair, then you can't criticize us, or you can't point out where our inefficiencies are, is I think it's a little premature. There are just a lot of things that go into what we mean by being fair, or being treated equally. And I know this is like is usually very a hot topic issue, and it's very emotional. But I, for one, I listen to a lot of people of color get shouted down, or their voices silenced because of these type of semantics of, can are minorities able to be reverse racist? And I don't think personally, I don't know any Black person who thinks that they're better than in any way to another race. The only thing that I understand from all people of color is they just want to have the same opportunities and the same understanding white people have, and just not be treated differently. But to say that, to criticize or to react in a negative way to things that's happened in history or even today, again, it's said in the moment, and I wish people would be a little bit more careful with their wording and what they say. I've been victim of it, with mass generalizations and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I don't think anyone's out there thinking, anyone as in people of color, oh, we should subjugate white people, we should shout down white people, we should kill white people, we should, I don't view the mindset of fairness that people of color are asking for in the same lens as a KKK person, which is why, literally when I hear racism, that's what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of all the extremes, and I'm thinking of all the different systems that went in to disenfranchising minorities, where that is not happening with white people. I'm hearing people now saying that being called a Karen is a racial slur. I can say Karen all day, like it's a name. I can't say the N-word. I mean, my family's West Indian, so our experience with America is different than Black Americans' experience. So in my family, we don't say the N-word at all. We don't think it should be used in music. Don't think it should be used by Black people. That is our experience and our belief. But at the end of the day, I can't honestly say that there's anything that a minority could do or own that is not open to white people. We can't stop white people from, doing things, where the opposite is true of white people. So, which is why I don't believe in this backlash where everyone's trying to play the oppression Olympics. There's an actual trophy that someone really wants to have. No one wants this. No one wants to be oppressed. Nobody wants to be treated differently. This is not a nice feeling. So I think there's this general misconception that special perks for being a minority, or a special perk for being an oppressed group. And so now everybody wants to be an oppressed group, and I just don't subscribe to that. I think it's very problematic that it's being used in the way that it is right now to silence people of color. But I'm sorry, John, you can go ahead.
No, this is really good. And Ambre, I'd love to get your take on this. And first of all, I completely agree that, you know, I mean, I think on the one hand, when people sometimes reduce everybody to their race or say terrible things about, you know, anyone who's white, that can devalue people at the individual level and reduce them to their race, and that can be hurtful in that way. So there can be, you know, times when the word Karen is overused with white women, and it could be hurtful. But at the same time, to compare that experience of wrongfully being called a Karen, yes, we should acknowledge that that can be hurtful. Someone could be white and can also be, you know, affected by dehumanizing language. We're all human. But to compare being called a Karen the wrong way to being called the N-word when you're a person of color is insane. And I think we need to acknowledge that, yes, we're all human and certain labels can be hurtful, but it's not the same thing as being called the N-word. And a lot of white people have this idea that, like, well, this is the new N-word or something. No, it's not. But I wanted to get your take on this because a big part of, you know, anti-racism or combating racism is, you know, white people explaining to other white people, because it shouldn't only be, you know, black people having to do all the work. I mean, I think whites should have the lexicon and the tools to communicate this stuff to other white people. And one of the biggest issues I run into is the language game. It's been so, there's such a problem of translation, and like Coleman Hughes said, with how the language works. So if I'm trying to explain to them, like you said, systemic racism is real. It's not just individual personal racism, like the Webster's Dictionary, where a white person inferiorizes, or any race inferiorizes another race. That is racism on an individual level. But there's also systemic racism, and we need to have the lexicon to talk about that and to talk about how systems of power can disproportionately disenfranchise Black people. So yeah, we need a word for systemic racism. The confusion becomes when any use of the word racism is supposed to only refer to prejudice plus power through critical race theory, and it's only referring to the systemic component of it. And therefore, we don't even have the lexicon, or at least people don't know the word that they're supposed to use to talk about dehumanizing racial views by minorities against white people or anyone. And so when people are told that racism can only be one way, it can only be prejudice plus power, and then it creates a lot of confusion. And that, like you said, that often creates pushback, where people are saying, wait a minute, but what about, you know, people like, you know, Nation of Islam or Black Israelites, or just random dehumanizing commentary on Twitter toward white people? Like, it's as if people feel there's no word for that. So if we have a lexicon, we need a functioning lexicon that allows people to have an idea of what we're even talking about, to define these terms. So the biggest obstacle I run into is the language game. I have to take like a few minutes and just caveat any conversation about racism. If I'm talking to fellow white people, I often have to at least explain to them, yes, people can be racially bigoted or prejudiced or racist toward other people, regardless of skin color, but people prefer the term racism to mean systemic racism, which is prejudice plus power. And I'm supposed to condense that in like a 30-second soundbite if I'm having a casual conversation at a bar. That's hard to do. And I'm a trained linguist. I mean, I speak multiple languages. I study language. I have a SciOp background. I still struggle with how to get this in to people in casual conversation. It's hard to do. So like, it seems like it would be more effective if we could say individual racism is real. It could go any direction. Systemic racism, however, is pretty much, you know, really affects people of color. You know, it's rare that white people, you know, you're not going to have a lot of systemic racism toward whites. It's really mostly toward, or completely toward, people of color. If we can distinguish that in people's minds, personal racism from systemic racism, you know, call it type 1, type 2 racism, personal or systemic, but people just want the word racism to mean only systemic racism. This makes it hard for me to talk to other white people without the right language, without defining the terms. And I'm supposed to be able to do this immediately with somebody from, South Dakota or drinking a beer wherever, just talking to them in an elevator or having a conversation over dinner. It's really hard to give a 5-minute lecture when you're having dinner with someone, And so as much as I try to do that, do you think it makes sense to try to make the language game more functional when it comes to, because I want to have these conversations and persuade people that systemic racism is a real thing, and you got to separate that from personal racism. So what I try to do, and I'd love your thoughts here, I just try to say, there's bigotry, which is not liking someone. There's prejudice, which is prejudging someone. You can be racist in the sense of thinking someone's inferior and not be technically bigoted. Bigotry means you don't like them. You may not have any hostility to someone, but you may have racist views. You may think they're inferior, but you're not overly bigoted. And so we need the lexicon to distinguish prejudice from bigotry, from racism, from like systemic racism. So I just try to use the old-fashioned personal versus systemic. I mean, could that, if anyone has a better idea, I'm all ears, and I should do more research on this, certainly, but.
I'm going to be honest. Like I mentioned before, my parents are immigrants from the Caribbean, and things are just the thought process, the value system is completely like different there. So when we, I was born here and stuff like that, but when I hear racism, instantly I think of racism equals power. And the thought of racism for me is what I'm more clinging to is the thought that a race is superior to another. And when I interact with other Black people and I listen to them talk about white people in general, and, when they're having like their criticisms and stuff like that, it's not coming from a place of, oh, we believe we are superior to white people. And
Right.
so why for me, it's like, I don't think using racism is appropriate. But on the other hand, to be fair, our education system is not exactly that good. So a lot of words are just left atrophying, and a lot of people like people of color jump to use the R word, and so it's lost its meaning, it's lost its forcefulness because it's used so often. I think 7 out of 10 times when Black people or any person of color states a situation is due towards racism, it is true. However, the 3 out of 10 times do exist as well. And I think a lot of people of color don't like to admit that at all, because it's just so much easier to say, okay, everything's racist. This person is treating me differently.
Right.
And so from we grew up, most people of color that I know of, we grew up always having to navigate these nuances and trying to figure out how to interact with each other and with white people. And so hearing like, well, it's more complicated than that. We can't just use one word. There are more nuances. It's not really new. We already know that because we've been socialized to get along with a lot of people with different views culturally, faith-wise and stuff like that, because, that's the way the world works. And I think for me, the reason why I see there's such a struggle in the white community to understand that is because they haven't really been socialized that way. It's very, I wouldn't say like them centric, but just, the world is what it is, and it makes sense for it to be that way. There's no questioning of it. I learned history, like everyone else in public school, and when Black History Month came, I always like rolled my eyes because it's the same thing over and over again. We're talking about slavery, we're talking about civil rights, but we're never talking about the contributions that Black people have made to America. We've never talking about the contributions Black people in general have made to the world. We're only ever talking about the failures and how I view it as failures and the almost like the asking of permission to be seen as human. And you get this discussion every year in school, and there's never, you spend the rest of the school year talking about all the great accomplishments of the European empires, all the great accomplishments of the American society and democracy, and all the accomplishments of white inventors and stuff. It almost feels like there was no contributions made by other races, that other races were sitting around twiddling their thumbs, waiting for white people to save them and educate them and civilize them. Yeah. And so when I always focus on how I felt during these years in, learning history, but I never really thought about what do my white counterparts think about it? And why don't they ever question, hey, what were people doing in China, while, Rome was being built? What were people doing in Africa while there was an industrial revolution? It's almost like the world is just encompassed by white achievements and white progression. And because they are inundated with that all the time, they don't really get the different type of it's hard for them to comprehend, okay, this is a problem, this is not the right way to look at the worldview. Whereas minority children who grow up with looking at white accomplishments, looking at white media, is already socialized to be a part of a global community. I cannot imagine a world without white people. I don't want a world without white people. But constantly I look on the screen and I see worlds thought up by, imagined by white people where I don't exist, where my friends don't exist. And so for me, I think it's an education. The education system has to work at pretty much teaching all races to be obviously more inclusive, but specifically teaching white people that they're not like the center of the world, and their definition of certain things is not exactly, it does not work for everyone. Everyone else is pretty much caught up on being socialized racially to other races and learning other cultures. And I think in a certain way, white people are stagnant in that, because everything has to include them. If it doesn't, then there's something wrong with the worldview, whereas everyone else is not like that. So in having discussions with other white people, I mean, I do think you could, split it like that, where there's like category 1 racism, category 2 racism. But at the end of the day, it really just comes down to, does anyone think, or is it okay to think that one race that had no control over how they were born is better than another? And to me, that's flat out what racism is. And if it doesn't fit into that category, I don't think it's racism. I think it could be bigotry. I think it could be, we need to, get used to using the other words. There are other words out there. It could be stereotyping, it could be bias, it could be bigotry. Racism, I think, has a special place because the idea is a race is superior to another race. And for one, I don't hear many minorities make those type of arguments. The arguments they make is that, maybe I don't trust white people because of the history. White people have a tendency to do certain things. And so this is, like a stereotype, of them. But I don't know many that are out there saying, well, we are the master race, we should inherit the earth, and white should be submissive to us. And
well, what happens is a lot of your fringe, like right-wing social media, Russian disinfo, they'll pick up like Black Israelites or very fringe people on the street corner saying things, they're a tiny, tiny fraction.
Very small.
They do not reflect the vast majority, but they'll amplify that. So, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, in all my time working with different communities, the vast majority of the time when, people of color, Black, Hispanic, or whoever are talking about whites or negatively about things white people do, they are not hating on all white people. They're not promoting a superiority narrative. Most people are not doing that. And I think it's important to get people to understand that. But also to your point, you're right. There's in our education system, most whites sadly couldn't tell you what the Harlem Renaissance or Black Wall Street was. We need to reboot a lot of aspects of our education system to amplify the accomplishments and elevate parts of history that are not taught. I think that's really important. And there's so much untapped, history and literature and art and expressions that are not brought into the mainstream narrative that, most people really don't know about these things if they're not, And so, no, I definitely agree. It's a big imbalance that we need to rectify. And I think it's in everyone's best interest to bring us together to do so, but it's going to require uncomfortable conversations. So, that's something we need to understand moving forward, I think.
So we're in this era right now where terms like racism, bigotry, being prejudicial are synonymous with immigration. And also these terms give rise to a social phenomenon like nationalism and populism. So when we look across the pond to our neighbors in the UK, they recently finalized the separation agreement for Brexit. And as most of you know, there was a public referendum back in 2016, which just happens to coincide with the presidential elections here in the US. There was a majority support in favor of Brexit. And now over the course of 4 years, after much delay and negotiations and renegotiations, they inked a final deal of separation. So I just want to get your feedback on whether if it will lead to a more successful outcome. Do you think there's going to be blowback? What were some of the underlying tensions that gave rise to Brexit? So what do you guys think?
You want to go first?
You can go, I can go first if you want. Totally up to you.
Sure, go ahead.
All right. Well, I'll just basically, I lived in Europe for a number of years when I was first in the Army. Mostly I was in Germany. I speak German, a number of other European languages. I frequently go back to Europe. Last time I was in Germany was 2016. It was an Army training mission, but me and a buddy, we took some extra time, went off to Prague. I went back to Germany to visit a family and friends that I knew there, a German family there. And I got some up close and personal perspective on the issue of immigration from various Middle Eastern and African countries, and some of the populism and the rise of ethno-separatism and sometimes white nationalism that's being fueled in Germany and France and other places. And these narratives are often fueled by not just right-wing propaganda. A lot of it also comes from the Kremlin. There's a lot of these right-wing extremist narratives or ethnocentrism or separatist ideologies where people want to break away from the EU, or white extremist groups voice extreme fear of immigration. These narratives have been propped up, and my personal opinion is that it's part of the intent there is to break apart NATO alliance and make Europe more fractured, more insular, and have them re-balkanize along these ethno-sectarian lines, which ultimately will make the West weaker. And the irony here is that these people talk about saving the West, but they're buying into a lot of these ethno-separatist narratives, about, breaking away from everything and promoting a white sort of ethno-state. These narratives will weaken Europe. But I think to counterbalance this, we do have to listen to a lot of the grievances that are, some of which are sensible. There's some legitimate dissatisfaction with the European Union, with some of the elitism that comes from the leaders coming out of the EU. There is a case for more respect for national sovereignty. And I think a failure to listen to some populist grievances by the elites has made it easier to push the Brexit narrative. And this has been amplified by some of your more toxic propaganda that amplifies these grievances and throws in a lot of amplifies your, racial resentments and your preys on people's fears. And so all of this multi-factor, these trends, of these different factors have played into, I think, what we see in Brexit. And I think the takeaway there is our leaders need to be better at combating a lot of your extremist narratives, combating disinformation, combating propaganda and white nationalism, but also listening to a lot of your average people and letting, not, when people feel they're not being listened to and people feel marginalized and neglected, then it often makes it easier for these far-right movements to take hold and get a foothold. So I think Brexit is due to a lot of factors. I think it's a very dangerous mentality. I think Europe needs to stay intact. I think we need a healthy way to coexist, or for Europe to coexist with the EU. And I think our leaders need to be realistic about doing it. I think we need a balance between the idea of unchecked mass immigration versus closing off the borders due to paranoia and ethno-separatism. I think we need a healthy immigration policy over in Europe. So our leaders need to find a way to realistically balance this stuff, and then they can better combat these extreme, these far right narratives. So that's my take on Brexit. But yeah, it's a very complicated issue, but a lot of it is driven by resentment, and there is some racism there too. So
Yeah, I agree with John. I usually what happens in countries when there is an economic downturn, I do feel that the first scapegoat is always the immigrants, especially like nations like Europe, the continent of Europe, they have like a very low fertility rate, and there are a lot of jobs that cannot be filled by the nationals that are there. And so immigration is actually very helpful for their economy, even though, on the surface, it might not seem that way to them. But you see that here, even in America, when manufacturing went out, a lot of opportunistic politicians would point out, well, it's because we had these trade agreements. Globalism is the problem. Later on, it turned into, well, you have a lot of immigrants coming over the border, taking your jobs. Really just dividing people apart from, citizens and non-nationals. And I think that's as well. They were losing. They lost their manufacturing in the 80s. They were always very skeptical of joining the EU in the first place, due to, I think it was different agreements made in 1992, where EU would be more involved in not just economic decisions, but also judicial and political decisions. And it just didn't sit right with the populace that we have, that there was another country or another body helping to influence decisions when the people themselves weren't having a voice. So a lot of the malcontent really should have been directed at what the governments were not doing or helping them with, but it just usually turns into the poor fighting each other, blaming each other on why they can't realize. So I do think all these things are connected. I remember watching some of the exit polls as people left in 2016 from voting with Brexit, and a lot of the things I heard were people coming out of the exit polls like, we're tired of all the Polish, we're tired of all the Czechs, and And to me, I was confused because it was almost sounded like something as if like Texas had said, a Texan had said, I'm tired of all the North Dakotans. Like, I'm like, you're all part of one continent. You kind of like have the longest history, whether it's warring with each other or intermarrying with each other. You guys came up together. So for you to have issues with like European migration just seemed odd. So I don't know. I thought it was not, it was a reactionary decision. I didn't feel that there were many positives from leaving the EU, especially since Britain enjoyed a lot of the benefits without having to take on as much as of the risks as everyone else, because they used the opt-out power to opt out of a lot of things. So it wasn't really like they were contributing as much as everyone else, and they were as entrenched as everyone else. So I don't know. I think it was a bad decision, but I'm not a person from the UK. But looking from the outside, I think it was completely reactionary. And because people are frustrated, they feel disenfranchised, and their governments aren't helping them. But instead of blaming the right people, they're blaming each other.
Yeah. When grievances aren't addressed, often the extreme narratives take hold and find ways to deflect and scapegoat. And that's a recurring pattern in human history, but it really transcends geography. And like you said, I think the solution is to, number one, we got to address the, real frustrations of the population, be more attentive, and bridge the gap between a lot of your elitist leaders and the people that are not being listened to, but also combat some of the, racism and separatist movements that really play on resentment and use immigrants as a scapegoat. And I know the UK, and I've been to the UK a number of times, and talked to a lot of some of their counter extremist people over there, both within the Muslim community as well as people that focus on white extremism. And there's a good system. The key a lot of times is dialogue. There's a good system of dialogue where people really will sit down on TV and really have vibrant conversations. And that model needs to be expanded. Because when conversation is, when people aren't able to have these conversations publicly and really talk about things honestly, those same conversations get pushed into the pubs and even into the darker corners of the internet and the chat rooms. And then you're going to have extremism growing and multiplying faster. You're going to have racist narratives take hold quicker. The key, I think, is open discourse and really separating, legitimate grievances and concerns for like more national sovereignty problems being neglected by the elites. That's understandable. We need to separate that from the racist and more extreme narratives that hijack those grievances and use that to try to redirect people's anger toward the immigrants, So yeah, I think the key is honest conversation and really amplifying voices while also calling out the more toxic narratives. But yeah, Brexit, I think that trend is very dangerous because I think it's a way to undermine the, Europe and the NATO alliance and create more ethno-sectarian fracturing and separatism, which makes Europe weaker economically, politically, in terms of defense. Our whole doctrine, in terms of strategy and military operations, is greatly nested in the flourishing of alliances and the strengthening of partnerships. That's not even up for debate. That is integral to our doctrine and to the way the NATO alliance works with the United States. That's why General Mattis really spelled this out in his resignation letter, and I encourage more people to read that letter and to understand that any competent person in the upper ranks of the military, pretty much any general or admiral, understands the need for alliances. You can debate the nature of these alliances. You could talk about how much NATO contributes, and you can debate certain things around NATO, but having strong partnerships and having a unified Europe should be something we all understand makes us stronger, geopolitically, strategically, and economically. I thought that was well established after, the 1950s, and yet these movements seem to believe that, ethno-sectarian tribalism is the best way forward and it's going to make everyone stronger. It's quite the opposite. And when these same types of people balkanize into their communities, the tribalism doesn't stop. These types of people, like on the alt-right or people that are adjacent to the alt-right, they always want to be better than someone else. There's always going to be some additional infighting among these white groups, some ethnic or sectarian or historic narrative where they want to further scatter and further balkanize or further wall themselves off, or these disputes with other people along these identity lines are going to continue. So the identity, the toxic form of identitarianism just keeps going. It just keeps regressing more and more. And, I've been through the Balkans. I speak not as well as I used to, but what they call Serbian, Croatian, or Bosnian, or Montenegrin. If people ask me what language is that, I don't know how to even say what the language is without offending people. Like, do I speak Serbian? Do I speak Croatian? Do I speak Bosnian, Montenegrin? They're technically the same language linguistically in terms of syntax and, being mutually intelligible. They're the same language by a basic linguistic definition, but they're socio-linguistically very distinct. They're historically distinct. Any Croat is going to say they speak Croat. If you tell them they speak Serbian, they'll be greatly offended, and vice versa. I remember when I was in Croatia, I was drinking with some Croats, and as soon as I brought up Serbia, this guy immediately was like, "I'll tell you what I do if I see a Serb. I take my gun and I kill that, MF." Everyone in the bar cheered. They're like, "Yeah!" And these are young people. Don't get me wrong. Like, things are getting better. The hate is dying out with the younger generation, but there's still deeply rooted historic divides in the Balkans. And when you flare up ethno-historical grievances and you make identity primarily about race, that only leads to more division and hate. And if when you don't base it on, when identity becomes tribalized along race and or along ethno-sectarianism, it only leads to bad things. I've been through like tons of European countries in the South and the West and in Central Europe. And this kind of identitarianism is absolutely toxic. It doesn't stop. It never stops. There's always going to be more of it. So that's what people need to realize about Europe, is that this direction is not going to lead to anywhere good.
Yeah, I'm always just, every time I think about it, I'm always disheartened about it, because this is like something that's been at least 70 years in the making, the making of the EU. And the whole point was to make a stronger, safer, more connected Europe. And they were having to deal with the fallout after World War II, where they were stuck between the United States and the USSR, and having to somehow rebuild themselves. Yes, a lot of it, a lot of money was given to them by the United States, but at the time they were more concerned with rebuilding each other in like a brotherhood. And I always thought that was very, very hopeful. Of course, with I think it was like France always pushing out the UK. It was, like a big brother, little brother fighting. But overall, the overall goal was a healthier, stronger Europe, because they did not believe that individually they could survive without each other. Which, they are just interconnected, both geographically, historically, economically. It just only made sense. And for the UK to decide that they were better off on their own, it's a little heartbreaking, because it was a beautiful thing to see, a continent come together like that. But on the other hand, I always find it interesting, because interesting in the sense that when you break things up racially, we all know race is not a real thing. There's nothing really different between any of us. However, I don't necessarily, now that we have race, I don't necessarily think having races is necessarily a bad thing, or having pride in one race is a bad thing. It only becomes a bad thing when you start determining that your race is more important or is special or better than another. And
Right.
so for me in Europe, their tensions make no sense to me, because obviously I'm a layperson in the UK, and not in the UK, in the United States. And to me, they're all the same. But I know very few Europeans that consider themselves racially white. They are ethnically diverse.
Yeah.
And so there are, like you mentioned, a lot of ethnocentric histories and issues that they haven't resolved. And over here in the United States, we're not any better. So I think it's just a natural human response to want to tribalize, to be a part of a group, and to designate other people as others, and try to stay within your group. And we really need to learn how to just break out of that. It's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily something where like everyone says, oh, we're colorblind, we don't see race. I think that's terrible. I think race is fine as long as there's not a negative connotation attached to it. And so for me, when it comes to immigration, it's a perfect opportunity for people to come together and share ideas and to replenish that brotherhood in humanity. But it's never, I don't know any instances where it's ever seen as a positive thing. Especially when it comes to people of color moving into predominantly white countries. However, predominantly minority countries usually welcome white investment and white any type of like help, because that's just, the idea is that globalism is a great thing. This was taught to us, this was told to us, that globalism lifts all boats and everyone will get better for it when we integrate as a whole. It just doesn't ever seem to be the same when it's on the other side. And so
Right.
I think the discussion should be more, the haves against the have-nots against the haves, but we're never going to get there because, I mean, it's really not in a government's best interest to tell people the truth. We just have to be serious. We just have to be honest about that. It's not in their best interest to tell people, well, we squandered the money away on bad investments or, greedy politicians. It's much easier to say, well, we squandered the money away on having to feed poor children. We're bloated with all this welfare spending.
Right.
This was the reaction after the 2008 crash. In 2010, everyone decided austerity was a great thing, and the idea was to cut social programs to reduce the bloating. And my question is always, if the answer is always I guess throwing poor people under the bus and cutting programs, how is the economy ever really supposed to thrive if everyone's poor and angry and hungry? You're just leading to a bigger problem later down the line.
It's unsustainable. I mean, that's how nations fail. If you have a virtuous cycle where there's more and more middle class and more inclusive participation in the political system, and there's a tide that lifts all boats, that is how capitalism is supposed to work. What we're seeing increasingly here and in Europe is an extractive system, not an inclusive one, but an extractive one, a vicious cycle where there's more and more a bad kind of inequality, a huge gap, where people at the top, the system is not lifting up people at the bottom, and the gap is widening, and the middle class is, shrinking in Europe, and this kind of vicious cycle, where power is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, this has caused nations to fail across history. The Mayans, the Venetians, and you look at Rome, you look at I think I brought this up in the last podcast. When you go to the Mexican border, why is one side so much more prosperous than the other. You have condos on one side, slums on the other. That's because of the kinds of institutions we have. And when Europe, if Europe wants to continue to have institutions that perpetuate this vicious cycle and this massive equality gap, it's going to lead to more disenfranchisement, more extremism, more violence, more extreme narratives, and more separatism. Grievances are going to be weaponized much more easily when everyone's desperate and poor, or when more people are desperate and poor. So they need to, you're right, it needs to be about a system of good capitalism, or a mixed economy where you have, social democracy, or you have free markets, and you have strong safety nets, and you have accountability in the financial system. This is absolutely crucial. I think that is a big center of gravity. I was also going to say that I totally agree about race in terms of like the absurdity of what I call whiteistan, this idea of like this that the alt-right promotes, where there's this is sort of ideologically homogenous, or this kind of interconnected whiteness among Europe, going like as if there's some like shared collective mind between the ancient Greeks and the Macedonians and the Slavic migrations and the Britons and the Celts. And I mean, it's like there's so much diversity. No one thought of themselves uniquely along the lines of race or as white until those concepts were invented down the road. People thought of themselves, along different lines. There was tribes and tribalism within, Britain, and anywhere you go, people thought of themselves as different bands or groups or religions or whatever. This idea of this universal brotherhood of whiteness was not a thing. And I could tell you from I study languages, like I'm learning Greek, I speak Russian, German, some Spanish, really bad Italian, and really bad French. I could tell you the diversity in terms of culture, language, all of that is so vast. And there's a lot of white nationalists that have a fascination with Russia as the last bastion of preserving white Christianity. And a lot of them want to go live there. And don't get me wrong, I speak Russian. I think it's a beautiful culture and language, but they don't realize they have more in common with most, Blacks or Latinos that share their culture than they do with the average Russian in the countryside. They're very different. And if these people think they're going to learn Russian, I want them to try. They'll be begging to learn Spanish within a month. They have no idea how.
Yeah, I always point out when you used to see the Trump and the Trump rallies where there were teachers when they were making fun that Trump got helped by Russian. They're like, I prefer the Russians over Democrats any day. And I was like, yeah, try to do the Russian alphabet. They do they're completely different from us. So yeah, try to move over there. You would not have a good time. I'm sorry.
No. And also like people that are, in terms of shared values, I think Europe should define their identity based on shared values. So like, I have a lot of friends that come from, Islamic countries, the Middle East and Central Asia, that are activists that promote science, secularism, gay rights, human rights, women's rights. Some of them came here as asylum seekers under death threat. And these people tend to value the Constitution and American history and democracy more than 90% of Americans do. These are people most red blood Americans would share a beer with more than anyone else. These are more American than most Americans. And so this idea that, people of different skin colors somehow can't uphold European values or American values, that's what a lot of people think, that in the, white, in the different, shades of white supremacy or white nationalism or whatever. Or even just there's a lot of people that believe that, immigrants can't uphold European values. Yes, they can. Don't get me wrong, there are some that do have trouble integrating. There are some that may cling to their own culture to the detriment of integration. That is a problem sometimes. There are people that subscribe to Islamist political systems, but most Muslims don't do that. And so, I think, we do need to have sensible immigration policies. We should encourage the right kind of integration where people can retain their culture and their identity, but still be proud of the country they're in and they can uphold those values of basic human rights. That happens all the time, and these people are often more serious about these values than people that are born in those countries and take it for granted. So a balanced immigration policy, I think, is the way forward, where you take the people that most want to be living in a free society, that value freedom and human rights. And those are the people, I think, that we should support here and in Europe. And really, by doing that, we can promote human rights in other countries as well, by amplifying these people, letting them get their voices out. And I think there's a way forward that can really be better for everybody when it comes to immigration.
And I just feel like it's just counterproductive. I mean, if they really thought about it, like I'm thinking of white supremacists here in America, the concern is always losing. The more immigrants that come here, the more the identity of America is changed, and we're losing it. And I mean, from my understanding, from what I learned in school, the whole point of America was the integration of immigrants and all the different cultures and ideas of different worlds coming together in one place and being able to coexist. So if white supremacists in America believe that they're patriots by not embracing that, I think they're misinformed. When they embrace ideas of it's okay to treat someone differently. Well, I mean, we have a whole 14th Amendment against that. When they embrace ideas of prejudging people and not giving them a fairness of the benefit of the doubt, that's against American, ideals. So I think they wrap themselves, and this is all over, because there's always going to be 30% of some population that's stuck in some type of xenophobia, racism, malcontent of the way the world is right now with globalism and people embracing ideas from different places. And they're always going to be that small population. It's just, I wish that they were not given as much attention as the people who are out there really doing the work, really making the changeover, where it's like a Muslim moving from the Middle East to America and learning to be more objective when it comes to women's rights and gay rights and stuff like that. Or people from India moving to America and learning about moving to the UK and learning that the caste system is not a good system, and just taking on more of these human rights values that you were bringing up. They're not respected. They're not held up as a beacon. Who are the ones who are not upholding the ideals that everybody else feels in the country. And that's just really not fair, because there are way more of people who believe in these ideals, that believe these institutions are sound and are the whole very idea of globalism, both in Europe and the United States, is a great idea, and they value it and appreciate it to a level that, I mean, some Americans honestly don't. And same thing with Europeans. Some Europeans don't really appreciate what they do have. And so I don't know, I always put everything down to education. We need to educate ourselves. We need to educate others. We need to have a discourse. We need to talk. We need to engage, and stop just spending time in an echo chamber.
If I could just summarize, looks like we're almost out of time. Sorry, John, but if I could just summarize how this Brexit kind of unfolded, it's really two factors. I know you guys kind of mentioned it, so I'll just summarize it really quickly. One is a failure of a neoliberalism economic mindset. And what I mean by that is around 2004, there was a massive expansion of the European Union, where the membership really doubled overnight, because they added 10 new nations, mostly from the Eastern Bloc, into the European Union membership. So I think that kind of watered down the cohesion of the European identity. And I think the historians will look at that moment as that's when they lost the focus of the spirit of what European Commission which is what gave rise to the EU, was about. Number two is, I think John kind of hit on it too, which is this kind of ethno-historical grievance. And what that means is a lot of these nations like the UK, France, they have a colonial past. And if you look at the ethnic minorities living in these nations, they're from their former colonies, like in the Middle East, Africa, etc. And I just don't think they've done an adequate job trying to have them be integrated as members of the community. So I think there's a lot of backlash that came about because of that. And now with Brexit that became final this year, I think just look to France to see what's going to happen. And next year there's going to be a presidential election, and the National Front candidate is going to make a comeback. And it's quite possible that Marine Le Pen, on behalf of the National Front, might prevail against the sitting president. And if that happens, then I think you could also see a Brexit equivalent in France follow suit. So that remains to be seen. But guys, we're almost out of time. I appreciate it. But before we sign off, Amber, I have a question, which is, do you have any book recommendations for us?
Oh, yes. I have, I read this book over the summer last year, and I thought it was an interesting read because, again, I completely believe in the EU. And so I didn't see the cracks and I didn't see a lot of things coming. But this book really pretty much outlined where everyone really got it wrong and where we pretty much did not take seriously some of the grievances that everyone had. So it's called The European Union in Crisis. It's by, Neil Nugent. I almost said Ted Nugent. I had to think of it.
Neil Diamond.
Or Neil Diamond too. But I think it's a really good read into all the little underlying issues that were out there that we didn't see coming. And so I think that would be very, very good for everyone to start to take a look at. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a good place to leave it. Thanks, Amber, and thanks once again to John and Annat. I appreciate it. This podcast would not be possible without you guys. So take care, be well, and see you at the next episode.
Thank you so much for the conversation, everyone.
Thank you.